Welcome back. Bitcoin transactions. So a transaction in Bitcoin is a data blob that is signed by the sender and aims to transfer funds to a receiver. Now you can think of here, we have on the left side, we have our friend Alice. She has a wallet. A wallet means she has a list of private keys and public keys, where the address is the hash of a public key. And Bob has the same, just a different private key, obviously. Now, if Alice wants to perform a transaction, what she will do is she will take an input to a transaction, right? This is an input here that specifies what do you want to insert into that transaction, what do you want to give to that transaction. And what's coming out is a list of outputs. This is basically what you can retrieve from the transaction. So she's putting in 1 Bitcoin, and obviously she cannot create coins out of thin air, so the sum of the outputs will have to be equal to the sum of the inputs. So, but she can decide how to distribute the funds inputted into that transaction. So she decides to send 0.25 Bitcoin to Bob, and she wants to send 0.75 Bitcoin to Alice. So obviously here this is the sender address, right? This is the recipient address, and that's the chain address, change address. So in Bitcoin, it's quite important to understand that we have this input here, and this input we cannot split it by itself, or we cannot just send away 0.2 Bitcoins without performing a change transaction or change output. So this output here is basically a change, so it's being sent back to Alice, if you will. And if you want to pay transaction fees, so I mentioned earlier that the sum of the outputs here must be smaller or equal to the sum of the inputs. Well, if the sum of the outputs is smaller than the inputs, then this is the amount of transaction fees that is paid to those entities that validate that transaction. And these are the miners. They are validating and verifying that this is actually a correct transaction, and they are appending it to the blockchain. So these are the transaction fees. If these values here are inferior to this, like if the sum of this is inferior to the input, then this is considered, the remainder is basically considered a transaction fee that you can claim as a miner. Now, great, we had 1 transaction, but what about several transactions? Well, here, if we have a second transaction, you can see how they are concatenated, how they are linked together, right? Alice has here she sent back the 0.75 coins to her own address. Well, and she can reuse them in a new transaction and, for example, send then 0.5 Bitcoin to a new address from Eve, right? This is quite, it's up to her how to handle her coins, obviously. So there's also Coinbase transaction. The Coinbase transaction is quite an important transaction. It's typically the first transaction in a block, and this is defined by the miner. And what's important about this transaction is that there's no input required. It's really basically creating coins out of thin air. As I said, we will be discussing what a block and what a miner is in a later lecture, but just think of it as a Coinbase transaction is a transaction that creates coins. And if you go to blockchain explorers, for example, here of blockchain.com, you can see that at the beginning of the block, so a block here is just a list of transactions. At the beginning, there's the Coinbase transaction, and there are no inputs, right? So these are newly generated coins. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next lecture.